On November 6, 1895, the most famous wedding in Gilded Age America was running 20 minutes late. The guests waiting inside St. Thomas's Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue were not told why. The police cordoning off the crowd outside were not told why. The newspaper reporters who had been camped on the steps since before dawn were not told why. What they were told was that there had been a small delay and that the bride would arrive shortly, and that everything was proceeding according to plan. The reason for the delay was that the bride, Consuelo Vanderbilt, 19 years old and heir to the greatest railroad fortune in the United States, had been crying since she woke up, and her eyes had swollen so badly that no amount of cold water and careful powdering could make her presentable. She had spent the morning of her wedding day alone in her room. No one came near her. A footman had been stationed outside her door with instructions not to admit anyone, including her own governess. She sat at her dressing table in the gown her mother had chosen and looked at the face of a woman walking towards something she could not escape, and she wept until there was nothing left. When she finally emerged and took her father's arm and walked down the aisle, the crowd turned to face her. Some of them noticed immediately. A woman in the third pew leaned to her neighbour and whispered something. A newspaper illustrator who had been given a seat near the front made a quick sketch. The sketch would later be published in a New York paper under a caption that no one from the Vanderbilt family ever publicly acknowledged, even though it was accurate in every detail. It showed Consuelo kneeling beside the Duke of Marlborough at the altar, her hands handcuffed behind her back, the chain held by her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, who stood to one side in her wedding finery, holding the end of it with the serene expression of a woman whose plan had worked exactly as intended. The Duke of Marlborough, for his part, had given up the English woman he was in love with to come to New York and marry a Vanderbilt. He had made this sacrifice, as he would later tell Consuelo on their honeymoon, in exchange for $2.5 million in railroad stock. He delivered this information on what was meant to be one of the happiest nights of her life. She did not cry. She had already used up every tear she had. This is the story of the daughters they sold, not metaphorically, not approximately. Sold in transactions negotiated by lawyers with the precision of commercial contracts. Daughters exchanged for titles and social standing, the way commodities were exchanged on the floors of the exchanges their fathers owned. Sold into countries where the laws stripped them of every financial protection they had brought with them. Sold to men they had never chosen, to families that viewed them as solutions to financial problems, to lives in drafty English castles so far from home that the homesickness alone was a kind of illness. Between 1870 and 1914, approximately 500 American women married into European aristocratic families. The Library of Congress later noted that American heiresses married more than a third of the entire House of Lords. Their dowries, when totaled, amounted to more than $4 billion in today's money. $4 billion transferred from the New World to the Old, from factory floors and railroad tracks to ancestral estates and crumbling palaces, mediated by women who were rarely asked whether they wanted to go. What happened to those women? What the transaction actually cost them beyond the ceremony and the title, and the momentary satisfaction of watching their mothers triumph over society, is the story that the newspapers mostly chose not to tell. To understand why this happened at the scale it did, you have to understand two different kinds of desperation meeting across the Atlantic and recognizing in each other something useful. The first desperation was British. By the 1870s, the British aristocracy, the dukes and earls and viscounts who had governed England since the Norman conquest, who had owned its land and defined its social order and commanded its armies for 7 centuries, was going quietly, then not so quietly, broke. The mechanism of their destruction was grain. American farmers working the vast new prairies of the Midwest with mechanical equipment and cheap labor and seemingly bottomless land had begun flooding the global grain market in the 1870s with harvests so enormous and so cheap that English farmers could not compete. English agricultural incomes collapsed. The rents that aristocratic landowners depended on dropped by 30, 40, sometimes 50% in a single decade. The estates that had sustained ducal dynasties for generations were suddenly generating a fraction of what they needed to maintain themselves. A roof needed replacing on a castle that housed 50 servants and fed 300 tenants. A drainage system that had been failing for 20 years finally failed completely. Son needed to be educated at Eton and Oxford, and then sent into the army or diplomacy at costs that no longer bore any relationship to the income the estate could produce. The aristocrats did not work. That was the other part of the problem. Not because they were lazy in any simple sense, but because work, actual professional employment for wages, was considered socially incompatible with their position. A duke who went into trade forfeited something more fundamental than income. He forfeited the thing that made him a duke. So he could not work his way out of the problem. He could only inherit his way out of it, or marry his way out of it. And since most of the daughters of the British upper class were in the same financial situation as the men they might have married, marrying within the English aristocracy solved nothing. But across the Atlantic, something extraordinary was happening. In the 40 years between the end of the Civil War and the turn of the century, the United States created the largest private fortunes in human history. The railroads, the steel mills, the oil fields, the grain elevators, the department stores, the industrial machinery of post-war America generated wealth at a speed and on a scale that had no precedent anywhere in the world. Men who had started with nothing built empires worth tens of millions, hundreds of millions, in some cases approaching $1 billion, all within a single lifetime. These men had daughters. And here is where the second desperation came in, because the money, as spectacular as it was, could not buy the one thing these newly rich American families wanted more than anything else. It could not buy acceptance from the people who had been rich the old way. New York's social structure in the Gilded Age was governed by a small, rigid, intensely exclusive group of families who traced their American lineages back to the colonial period. The Knickerbocker families, the old Dutch and English merchant dynasties who had been New York before New York was New York. These families, led by the formidable Caroline Astor, had constructed a social hierarchy as precisely stratified as anything in Europe, and they had drawn the line between old money and new money, with a clarity that no amount of railroad stock could simply purchase away. Caroline Astor's annual ball, the single most coveted invitation in New York society, was famously limited to 400 guests, reportedly because her ballroom held 400 people, but actually because the number represented precisely the universe of people she considered socially acceptable. The Vanderbilts, for all their spectacular wealth, were not in those 400. Alva Vanderbilt, Consuelo's mother, had spent years trying to force her way into that circle and been rebuffed at every attempt. The Astors would not come to her parties. The Knickerbocker families would not call on her. The doors of the houses that mattered stayed closed. Europe offered a different calculation. In London, in Paris, in the drawing rooms of Blenheim and Castle Howard, and the great houses that had been old when America was still being mapped, a pretty American girl with a large dowry was welcome in ways she would never be welcome in Caroline Astor's ballroom. Not because the English aristocracy was less snobbish. It was considerably more snobbish in ways that the American nouveau riche found both baffling and thrilling, but because the English aristocracy was broke, and an American girl with $2 million in railroad stock attached to her was useful in ways that an invitation to a New York ball was not. The transaction was understood by everyone involved and acknowledged by almost no one. There was a publication called Titled Americans, distributed to the right families on both sides of the Atlantic, that listed available European noblemen with their titles and estimated fortunes, and made clear which ones were in the market for an American bride. It read less like a social register and more like a catalogue. An American press commentator of the period noted, with the tone of someone attempting dark humor and not quite managing it, that these girls were being treated like a mineral deposit, a natural resource that both nations should be entitled to tax. The mothers were the architects, almost always the mothers. The fathers supplied the money and occasionally the objections. The mothers supplied the strategy, the European contacts, the careful manoeuvring through London social seasons, the introductions at country house parties, where the right duke might happen to find himself adjacent to the right American girl at the right moment. Alva Vanderbilt had been planning Consuelo's marriage since Consuelo was approximately 12 years old. She had decided on a duke. She had specific preferences about which duke. She had arranged the introduction with the care of a military campaign and the patience of someone who had been planning it for years and was not going to allow a daughter's preferences to interfere with the outcome. What neither the mothers nor the daughters fully understood, in most cases until it was too late, was what marriage to a British aristocrat actually meant for an American woman under British law. Under British law, a wife's legal identity was still, in 1895, substantially absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property independently. She could not maintain her own bank account without his permission. The money her father had settled on her as a dowry became his upon marriage, and while most careful fathers inserted language into the marriage settlements that established trusts protecting at least some of the income, the practical reality was that he controlled the household finances, he controlled where they lived, he controlled whether she was allowed to return to America for a visit, and he controlled what happened to the money if he decided the trust language was worth contesting. One writer of the period put it plainly if bitterly: once an American heiress crossed the threshold of her new home in England, her lord was literally her master. She could not own property. She could not have even her own pin money. The settlements her father had negotiated might protect her on paper, but if the husband chose to access her accounts, British law at the time gave him the ability to do it. And the men who married American heiresses, it turned out, were not, as a general rule, the kind of men inclined to restrain themselves in the matter of spending other people's money. Consuelo Vanderbilt did not choose the Duke of Marlborough. She could not have been more explicit about this. She had, before her mother intervened, made her own choice. A young American named Winthrop Rutherford, handsome, part of old New York, the kind of man she might have loved if she had been allowed the opportunity. Her mother had been informed of this attachment and had responded with the full force of her personality, which was considerable. Consuelo was told in clear terms that she would not be marrying Winthrop Rutherford. She was told this at 17, at 18, and again at 19. She resisted. She threatened to elope. Her mother responded by having her watched at all hours, by refusing to allow her to go anywhere unescorted, by intercepting her correspondence. When Consuelo attempted to get a letter to Winthrop, the servants reported it. When she tried to arrange a meeting, the arrangement was discovered and prevented. The engagement to the Duke of Marlborough was announced in 1895. Consuelo had not agreed to it. She had been told it was happening. What finally broke her was not force, but manipulation of a more insidious kind. Alva told her daughter that the stress of Consuelo's resistance had brought on a near-fatal heart attack. She appeared to be gravely ill. She told Consuelo that the refusal to marry the Duke was killing her. Consuelo was 19 years old and she loved her mother despite everything. And the thought that her stubbornness was literally destroying the woman who had raised her was more than she could sustain. She agreed. Alva made a swift and complete recovery. The wedding preparations moved forward at extraordinary speed. The Duke attended the settlement negotiations, the meeting at which the financial terms of the transaction were finalised, with great punctuality, but declined to attend the wedding rehearsal, which he described as vulgar. He explained that he had given up the English woman he loved to come to New York. He wanted it understood that this was a sacrifice and that the sacrifice had a price. And the price was $2.5 million in Beech Creek Railroad stock, generating at least $100,000 a year in guaranteed income. These terms had been agreed by the lawyers. He had simply come to confirm them. On the morning of the wedding, Consuelo was locked in her rooms. A footman stood outside her door. She spent the morning weeping alone. When she finally emerged, her veil covered her face for the practical reason that nothing else could. She walked down the aisle to marry a man who had not looked at her the way a man looks at a woman he has chosen. He looked at her the way a man looks at a financial instrument he has successfully acquired. She wrote later that she was grateful for the veil, not for tradition, not for beauty, because it hid her eyes, which were still swollen from a morning of grief. And if the people in those pews had seen her eyes, they would have understood exactly what they were watching, and the performance would have collapsed entirely. The cartoonist who drew the handcuffed bride understood it. He published it anyway. Nobody important ever acknowledged that he had gotten it right. The marriage proceeded in the way that most such transactions proceeded, which is to say, it produced children, 2 sons, both required, and then it produced distance. The Duke and Duchess of Marlborough lived separately for most of their 25-year marriage. He continued seeing other women. She developed interests of her own, philanthropy, housing reform, eventually suffragism, and built a public life in England that bore almost no resemblance to the life she had crossed the Atlantic to live. She was beloved by the tenants on the Blenheim estate, which said something. The people who depended on the Duke and Duchess for their livelihoods had formed their own opinions about the characters of both. They preferred the Duchess. She visited them when they were ill. She funded improvements to their cottages from her own allowance. She understood, in a way that the Duke did not seem to, that the relationship between a great house and the people around it was one that required cultivation and humanity and the occasional willingness to sit in someone's kitchen and drink tea that you did not particularly want. She never loved the Duke. She had been 19 and deceived and trapped, and by the time she understood fully what had been done to her, she was in England with 2 small children and a legal structure designed to make leaving as difficult as possible. English divorce law at the time required a wife to prove not just infidelity, but physical cruelty, a standard her lawyers told her was essentially impossible to meet in practice. So she waited. She maintained the household. She performed the role. She was photographed at coronations and court presentations and charity events in jewels and finery that the Vanderbilt millions had paid for, looking exactly as beautiful and exactly as empty as the position required. The Duke eventually fell in love with an American woman he had met independently, Gladys Deacon, and the desire to marry her provided a motive for ending the marriage that the lawyers could work with. The divorce was finalized in 1921. The marriage was subsequently annulled by the Vatican at the Duke's request. When the Vatican investigators asked Alva Vanderbilt, then in her 70s and a convert to feminism and women's suffrage, whether the marriage had been coerced, she answered with a directness that must have been bracing. "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke," she told them. "I have always had absolute power over my daughter. The annulment was granted." The Duke converted to Catholicism and married Gladys Deacon. Consuelo married a French aviator she had met independently and with whom she had chosen, and she spent the rest of her long life in a state of comparative happiness that she had been denied for the first 40 years of it. She lived until 1964. She wrote a memoir called The Glitter and the Gold. It is not an angry book. That is perhaps the most devastating thing about it. She had been angry for decades, and by the time she wrote the memoir, she had processed the anger into something else, something more measured and more sorrowful. And the sorrow on every page is the kind that comes not from a single wound, but from a long time spent understanding the shape of what was done to you. The Vanderbilts were the most famous case. They were not the worst one. Helena Zimmerman was born in Cincinnati in 1878 to Eugene Zimmerman, a railroad magnate who had accumulated his fortune through Standard Oil holdings and a seat on its board. Her mother died of peritonitis when Helena was 4 years old. Eugene raised her alone, sent her to school in France, and cultivated in her the polish and accomplishment that he hoped would make a fine marriage possible. He was a careful man with his money and with his daughter, and the two qualities, as it turned out, were more connected than he realized. In 1900, at a costume ball at a resort on the Brittany coast, Helena met William Angus Drogo Montague, the 9th Duke of Manchester. He was 23, she was 21, he had blue eyes and a title, and a manner of looking at a woman that suggested the world arranged itself around him as a matter of natural principle. He had also, by the age of 20, established himself as one of the most accomplished fortune hunters of his generation. The Duke of Manchester was nearly bankrupt. He had been nearly bankrupt for some time. His father, the 8th Duke, had himself married an American heiress, the Cuban-American socialite Consuelo Vanderbilt, and had gone bankrupt anyway because the Manchester family's talent for spending money exceeded any heiress's ability to supply it. The 9th Duke had inherited the title and the debts and the habits, and had been industriously prospecting for a new American solution to the Manchester problem since he was old enough to attend parties where Americans with daughters might be present. He had announced himself engaged to several heiresses before Helena. May Guelet, one of the wealthiest American heiresses of the era, had been listed in at least one newspaper as his fiancée. She had not agreed to this, and presumably was not pleased to read about it. The Duke of Manchester had announced the engagement unilaterally as a method of buying time with his creditors, who might be induced to wait a bit longer if they believed a large American fortune was imminent. After a newspaper ran a photograph of him, surrounded by portraits of the 22 women he had been engaged to at various points, his romantic reputation was, in the most diplomatic possible phrasing, complicated. Helena did not know this, or she knew some version of it, and believed that what she was experiencing was different, that she was the one who had found the real man beneath the public image, that his interest in her was genuine in a way that his interest in the others had not been. She was 21, and he was charming, and he had blue eyes and a title, and the romantic machinery of a Brittany costume ball working in his favour. And by the time she had spent enough time with him to form a clear picture, the picture had already been formed. They married in November 1900 in a quiet ceremony in London, without the permission or presence of either of their parents. Eugene Zimmerman, who had been manoeuvring carefully to ensure that any marriage his daughter made would protect her financially, learned about the wedding from the newspapers and a cablegram from Helena. His response was not recorded, but can be inferred from his subsequent legal arrangements. Eugene Zimmerman was not a fool. He knew exactly what the Duke of Manchester was. He settled on Helena a fixed annual income and took extraordinary care with the language of his will to ensure that under no circumstances whatsoever would the Duke ever inherit $1 of the Zimmerman fortune directly. The principal would remain in trust. Helena would receive only the income. The Duke would receive nothing. When Eugene died in 1914, his estate was valued at approximately $10 million, all of it locked away in precisely the legal structure he had designed to keep it out of the hands of the man his daughter had married. It was not enough. The Duke of Manchester went through enormous amounts of money anyway, working through whatever portion of the income he could redirect, through whatever personal loans Helena guaranteed, through whatever creative arrangements he could construct between himself and the trust mechanisms that were meant to be impermeable. By 1918, 66 petitions of bankruptcy had been filed against him in the English courts. 66! He had burned through the income of one of the largest American fortunes of the era and still needed more. He had been sued by his jeweller for failing to pay for the imitation pearl necklaces he had bought his new bride as a wedding gift. Imitation pearl necklaces, purchased because he could not afford real ones, left unpaid because even that modest expenditure exceeded what he could manage. He was found in bed with 4 women on at least one occasion that became public knowledge. One of them was a famous actress. He lost the Irish castle that Eugene Zimmerman had bought for the couple as a wedding gift, selling it to pay debts. It became a Benedictine monastery. He was sent to Wormwood Scrubs prison, for illegally pawning the Manchester family jewels, which were held in trust and not legally available to him to sell or pledge. He did it anyway. Helena lived through all of it. She had children, 4 of them, and she maintained a public face that gave away nothing, because the alternative to maintaining a public face was acknowledging what her marriage had become, and the laws that would have allowed her to escape it were not in place and would not be in place for years. When the separation finally came, and eventually the divorce in 1931, it was the Duke who fled to Cuba to obtain it, apparently finding even the standard English divorce process too slow or too complicated for his patience. He remarried almost immediately, another American girl. He died in 1947, having learned nothing and regretted nothing and contributed nothing to any human endeavour except the systematic demonstration that a title and a face and the willingness to claim fictional engagements with wealthy women is, under certain social conditions, a sufficient business model. Helena remarried in 1937 to a man who, by all accounts, treated her with ordinary decency and lived until 1971 at a Scottish estate. She gave no interviews about her first marriage. She left no memoir. She had 31 years to think about it after the Duke died, and she chose silence, which is itself a kind of answer. Anna Gould was the daughter of Jay Gould, the most hated man in Gilded Age America. Jay Gould had built his fortune through methods that his contemporaries described as unethical, and that later historians have described as, in some cases, straightforwardly criminal. He had manipulated stock markets, bribed judges, purchased politicians, and engineered financial panics for personal advantage with a consistency and creativity that had made him simultaneously one of the wealthiest and one of the most despised men in the country. When he died in 1892, the New York World, never his friend, published an editorial that expressed sentiments his surviving family found difficult to dispute. He had never been loved and rarely trusted, and his fortune of $72 million, enormous even by Gilded Age standards, carried with it a reputation that made social acceptance in America essentially impossible for his heirs. Anna, born in 1875, was the 5th of his 6 children, the shorter, less beautiful one, the one who was described in newspapers with a tactlessness that was standard for the era as homely, as plain, as not the sort of girl whose looks would work in her favour. She had frizzy hair and an asymmetrical face, and walked with a slight limp from a childhood injury. She also had approximately $12 million from her father's estate and an iron determination, inherited directly from the man whose reputation she could not escape, to get what she wanted. What she wanted by 1894 was to be married. Not to any particular person, to be married. She was 19, and she had been watching her contemporaries move through the rituals of courtship and engagement, and had decided she did not want to be left out any longer. She was engaged to Oliver Harriman, a financier, a perfectly acceptable American match that would have produced a perfectly acceptable American life. Then she went to Paris to buy her trousseau. In Paris, she met Paul Ernest Boniface, the Comte de Castellane, known to everyone as Boney. He was 27 to her 19. He was the archetype of the Parisian aristocrat, perfectly assembled from the best available materials: porcelain complexion, blue eyes, blonde hair, a moustache that curved with the precision of someone who had given it considerable thought, an elegance of dress and manner that made everyone around him look like they had dressed in the dark. He was also, under the elegant surface, deeply and creatively in debt, without serious income, and in urgent need of someone with $12 million who could be persuaded that he was in love with her. He was persuaded to be in love with her. She was persuaded that he was. The engagement to Oliver Harriman was dissolved. The engagement to the Comte de Castellane was announced. Both families had reservations. Both families went along with it because the alternative was having Anna, who had her father's will in addition to his money, as an enemy, and that was not a position anyone who had observed Jay Gould in operation was eager to occupy. They were married in March of 1895. He had been planning how to spend her money before the ceremony was over. What Bonnie de Castellane did with the Gould fortune over the next 11 years was a performance of extravagance so sustained and so spectacular that it requires some effort to convey without making it sound almost admirable. He built a pink marble palace in Paris, not a townhouse, but a palace, constructed at a cost of 4 million gold francs and decorated with a comprehensiveness that left no surface unadorned. He hosted parties at this palace for 2,000 guests at a time, events so lavish that the newspapers ran special supplements to document the details. He collected art and furniture and objects of all kinds, with the systematic focus of a man who had concluded that money is most usefully understood as a substance that needs to be moved from one account to another as rapidly as possible, preferably via the most aesthetically interesting route available. He also had affairs, systematically and apparently without particular shame, which was consistent with the social expectations of the French aristocracy, where a gentleman's extramarital activities were considered his own business as long as they were conducted with appropriate discretion, and where appropriate discretion was defined generously. Anna knew about the affairs. She knew about the spending. She watched the money flow out of her father's estate and into the pink marble palace and the parties and the art collections and the debts and the women. And she said very little for 11 years because she was building her case. One afternoon in 1906, while Bonnie was at his seat in the Chambre des Députés, attending to whatever parliamentary business required his presence that day, Anna acted. She had arranged everything in advance. She had hired the removal men. She had coordinated with her lawyers. She had timed it precisely to maximize the impact and minimize his ability to interfere. When Bonnie came home that evening, the house was dark. Every stick of furniture was gone, the art was gone, the silver was gone. The staff had been paid off and dismissed. The telephone had been cut. There was nothing left but the walls of the palace he had built with her money, standing empty in the Paris dark. The next day, he was served with an application for legal separation. The divorce proceedings that followed were, as one newspaper described them with genuine admiration, spectacular. Anna appeared at every session, organised and precise, with documentation going back years. She'd been keeping records. She had always kept records. She was Jay Gould's daughter after all. She walked out of French courts the following year, with the marriage dissolved, the children, and the legal right to do whatever she chose, with whatever remained of the fortune that had not been redirected through the pink marble palace. She then married Bonnie's cousin, the Duke of Talleyrand, who had his own money, and who seems to have understood that he was dealing with a woman who had made one mistake in her life and had absolutely no intention of making it again. The Count spent years attempting to have the Catholic marriage annulled so that he could remarry within the church. 9 cardinals ultimately reviewed the case. The Vatican upheld the marriage's validity. Time magazine, reporting on the final ruling in 1925, compared the duration and complexity of the proceedings to Henry VIII's attempt to escape Catherine of Aragon. It was not an unflattering comparison from Anna Gould's perspective. She had beaten him at the Vatican as thoroughly as she had beaten him in the Paris courts. She was very much her father's daughter in the end. Jay Gould would have appreciated both the strategy and the execution. The system that produced Consuelo and Helena and Anna and the 400 other women who crossed the Atlantic to pay for aristocratic roofs with American money was not an accident or an aberration. It was the logical outcome of 2 entirely rational economic forces meeting at the precise moment when both needed what the other had to offer. The British aristocracy needed cash. The American nouveau riche needed social legitimacy. The daughters were the mechanism through which the exchange occurred. They were also, to state the obvious plainly, the people who actually lived with the consequences. The London social season existed partly as a venue for these transactions, to be arranged in settings that allowed everyone involved to maintain the fiction that romance was occurring. There were social secretaries who specialised in making introductions between English lords and American families. There were American mothers who planned European trips around specific targets and maneuvered their daughters into proximity with them through the precise management of guest lists and country house invitations, and the art of being in the right drawing room at the right moment. The fathers supplied the money, usually with the slightly helpless air of men who had made their millions in industries they understood completely, and were now being asked to participate in a social negotiation whose rules they did not know and could not quite follow. Some of them resisted. Jay Gould had wanted better for Anna and had died before he could prevent the Bonnie de Castellan marriage. Eugene Zimmerman had done everything a careful father could do, short of actual refusal, and the Duke of Manchester had spent his way through the protections anyway. Frank Work, whose daughter Frances had married an Irish baron who spent her dowry on gambling debts, wrote 15 separate codicils to his will, controlling his daughter's inheritance based on her love life, trying from beyond the grave to prevent the exact financial consequences he had watched happen in his lifetime. The codicils did not work. Frances fell in love again with a Hungarian horse trainer, and her father's will excluded her entirely. She died, having spent most of her life navigating the terms of a fortune she had never controlled and marriages that had never been fully her own. Some of the fathers saw through the system clearly enough to articulate what it was. Frank Work, never a man to manage his feelings about the aristocratic marriage market with restraint, told a reporter, "As fast as our honourable hard-working men can earn this money, their daughters take it and throw it across the ocean." For what? For the purpose of a title and the privilege of paying the debts of so-called noblemen. "If I had anything to say about it," he said, "I would make an international marriage a hanging offence." He did not mean it literally, probably, but the bitterness was real. And it came from watching a transaction conducted in the name of his daughter's future that he understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent his life reading financial documents, was a transaction conducted at his daughter's expense. Not every one of these marriages was Consuelo Vanderbilt, locked in her room the morning of her wedding. It is worth saying this, because the full picture is more complicated than a single narrative of coercion and misery can contain. Some of the women who crossed the Atlantic went willingly and happily. Jenny Jerome, the daughter of the financier Leonard Jerome, met Lord Randolph Churchill at a party in 1873 and was engaged to him 3 days later. The match was not without its financial complications. The Churchills had to be persuaded by the Jerome money, and the negotiations over the marriage settlement were conducted with the enthusiasm of people who were genuinely counting on the outcome. But Jenny wanted to marry Randolph, and Randolph wanted to marry Jenny, and the money facilitated something that would have happened anyway. Their son, Winston Churchill, would become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He had, among other inheritances, his mother's extraordinary force of personality and his grandfather Jerome's willingness to state his opinions regardless of the room. May Guelet, who had inherited approximately $20 million from her father and who had watched the spectacle of the Consuelo Vanderbilt wedding from her position as a bridesmaid in the wedding party, took a different approach. She refused offers for years. She was rich enough and confident enough to wait for a man she actually wanted to marry. And when she found him, the Duke of Roxburgh, a Scottish nobleman of genuine character who had loved her before he knew the details of her fortune. She married him in 1903, and the marriage was genuinely happy by all accounts for the nearly 30 years it lasted. Consuelo, watching from her position of comparative misery, described May with the gentle bitterness of a woman observing someone who had been allowed to do what she had been denied. Her chief interests were needlework, salmon fishing and bridge. To these diversions she devoted a good brain, which might perhaps have been used to better purpose. But Consuelo's bitterness at May's domesticity was in some ways a measure of what Consuelo had been denied. May had chosen her domesticity. Consuelo had been assigned hers. The difference between choosing and being assigned is the difference between a life and a sentence. The women who were assigned their marriages knew this difference from the moment they understood what was happening, and the knowing did not make the sentence easier to serve. The broader social machinery that produced these marriages began to slow around 1910 and had effectively stopped by 1914. The outbreak of the First World War ended the London social season that had served as the primary venue for transatlantic aristocratic matchmaking, and after the war, the world was sufficiently different that the old mechanisms did not reassemble in quite the same way. The Reform Acts that gradually expanded women's legal rights in England meant that by the 1920s, an American heiress married to an English lord had somewhat more legal protection than Consuelo Vanderbilt had possessed in 1895. The Married Women's Property Act of 1882 had already changed some of the most egregious features of the law, but enforcement and cultural practice had lagged behind the statute for decades. There was also gradually a change in what the American women themselves were willing to accept. Consuelo Vanderbilt's memoir, published in 1953, was the most prominent public testimony from the inside of one of these marriages, and it made clear to any reader who chose to pay attention that what had been presented as a fairy tale had been experienced as a very different kind of story. Alva Vanderbilt's testimony to the Vatican, stating plainly that she had forced her daughter to marry the Duke, and that she had always had absolute power over her daughter, was a kind of confession that no amount of post-facto suffragism could entirely undo. The mothers, who had been the architects of these transactions in almost every significant case, aged into various degrees of awareness about what they had done. Alva Vanderbilt became a prominent suffragist in her later years, advocating for women's right to vote and women's right to control their own lives. There is no record that she ever directly connected this advocacy to the morning she had stationed a footman outside her daughter's door and waited for Consuelo to run out of tears. Perhaps she made the connection privately, perhaps she did not. The record contains the advocacy and the silence about the connection, and the reader is left to interpret both. Consuelo Vanderbilt died in Southampton, New York, in December of 1964 at the age of 87. She was buried, at her request, in the churchyard near Blenheim Palace, near, but not at. Near the place where she had spent 25 years in a marriage she had not wanted, close enough to acknowledge the years she had spent there, far enough to make clear that they had not been the whole of her life. She had been married a second time, happily, for 35 years before her second husband's death. She had done philanthropic work in England and France. She had served on the London County Council. She had worked with women's suffrage organisations. She had built, in the decades after her escape from Blenheim, a life of genuine purpose and occasional joy. She had also spent 40 years married to a man who had told her on their honeymoon that he had given up the woman he loved to come to New York and collect her. Helena Zimmerman lived until 1971. Her first husband, the Duke of Manchester, spent his later years in a Sussex seaside town, declining, having run out of other people's money and other people's patience, and most of the other resources he had spent his life exploiting. He died in 1947. Helena outlived him by 24 years without mentioning him publicly once, which was a discipline that probably cost her nothing. Anna Gould lived until 1961. She spent the latter part of her life at Lyndhurst, her father's estate in Tarrytown, New York, which she had purchased from her sister's estate and left to the National Trust for Historic Preservation when she died. She outlived both her husbands, her son Howard, who took his own life in 1929, and the Count who had spent her money and then spent years asking the Vatican to give him permission to do it again to someone else. She had no interviews left to give about any of it. The pink marble palace that Bonnie de Castellane had built in Paris with her money was demolished in 1969. Nothing remains of it. In 1915, a book called Titled Americans published its final edition. It listed, with the thoroughness of a comprehensive catalogue, all 454 marriages between American women and European aristocrats that had occurred between 1870 and 1914. It was, in a sense, a ledger, a record of the transactions. What it did not record, because no one had thought to keep that account, was what those transactions had cost the women who had been on one side of them. The years in houses where the cold came through the walls because the heating had failed and could not be repaired. The children born to men who had told them frankly that they had not come to America for love. The letters home to mothers who had arranged the marriages and could not be told how bad things were without dismantling a whole architecture of ambition and self-justification. The mornings spent in locked rooms, crying until there was nothing left, putting on the veil because it covered the evidence. The account of those costs is not in Titled Americans. It is in Consuelo's memoir, in Helena's silence, in Anna's early morning meeting with the removal men, in the cartoonist's sketch of the handcuffed bride with the chain held by her mother. These women were among the luckiest women in the world, by the standards their era used to measure luck. They were beautiful, most of them, and rich, all of them, and titled after the transactions were complete. They had houses that were architectural monuments. They had jewels that filled cases. They were received at court and photographed in their coronets and written about in newspapers that made their lives sound like what their mothers had imagined they would be. But a daughter sold is still a daughter sold, regardless of what the price was and regardless of how grand the inventory of what she received in exchange. The price was her choice. The choice was the thing that could not be bought back. Consuelo Vanderbilt knew this. She wrote her memoir in her 70s, in the careful, measured prose of a woman who had processed a long time's worth of difficult truth. She called it The Glitter and the Gold. It is not a title that invites misunderstanding. The glitter was real. So was what was beneath it. And if you visit Blenheim Palace today, the great Baroque palace in Oxfordshire, the home that cost the 9th Duke of Marlborough $2.5 million in railroad stock and one American girl's entire future. The guides will show you the Great Hall and the long library and the gardens that stretch to the horizon. They will tell you about the Churchills and the battles and the centuries of history written into the stones. They may or may not mention the Duchess who funded the roof repairs and visited the tenants and sat in the women's ward of the London County Council and wept on her wedding morning behind a veil that was the only mercy available to her. She is buried nearby, as she requested. Near, but not at. Close enough to acknowledge. Far enough to make the point. That is how you know which part of the story she wanted to be remembered by. Not the glitter, not the title, not the handcuffs. The distance from the palace. The fact that she chose the distance herself.